Now I want to start this video by noting two things. First of all, whilst abortion access isn't technically a human right in itself, abortion access is necessary to uphold no less than 11 individual human rights, meaning attempts to unfairly block or restrict abortion access violates one or more of the following: rights to health and health care, right to information, rights to non-discrimination and equality, right to be free from cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment, right to privacy, right to decide the number and spacing of children, right to security of person, right to liberty, right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress, right to freedom of conscience and religion, and perhaps most ironically considering the anti-abortionist stance, the right to life. So when I say abortion access is a human right, what I'm referring to is no one singular right. I am in fact referring to 11 separate human rights relating to abortion access for all people who have a functioning womb. People such as cis women, trans men, non-binary folk, and some intersex people. Secondly, abortion access as a human right is in no way predicated on the definition of human life and when it begins. An individual's right to life does not override another individual's bodily autonomy. This is most often seen in a medical setting. If there's a child in the next room bleeding to death, and you are the only person within reach who is an exact match needed to save their life, in spite of the fact that they are a conscious, living, breathing child and your blood will come back within days, the doctors can't touch you without your permission, even if you're the parent of the child. Hell, even the deceased are afforded this right. If you refuse to donate your organs prior to your death, doctors are not allowed to take as much as a single skin cell, even if it means saving another person's life. Meaning that when someone asserts that a pregnant person must carry a fetus to term in spite of their bodily autonomy, they're declaring that person to have less human rights than the recently deceased. Now I'm sure we'll come back to this in future videos, but I just wanted to clear those things up before responding to today's video titled, When Does Life Begin? Does Life Begin at Conception? By YouTube channel, What Would You Say? So why am I responding to this video if the question is irrelevant? Well, partly because I've decided to work through their library in published order, but mostly because this video shows how they frame their opposition, those of us who take a pro-choice stance. There are a lot of little tricks and dishonest tactics they roll out to prime their audience to think about the opposition in a specific manner, and I feel like that's still worth breaking down before we begin to move forward, just so anti-abortionists know minor Dita's positions on the matter, which is the position shared by many people. So that made clear, let's get down to business.
You're in a conversation about abortion and someone says, human life doesn't begin at conception, it's just a clump of cells. What would you say? It's easy to say life doesn't begin at conception because an embryo doesn't look like what we think people should look like.
Except the reasoning behind this argument isn't premised on looks but rather traits. Life has no one definition. Various fields of science and philosophy have differing definitions dependent on the field's focus and needs. If you ask me whether life began at conception, my answer would depend on what field I was talking about. If I were talking about cellular biology, then yes, I'd quickly acknowledge that life began at conception, specifically cellular life. Life to the same degree as that seen in single-celled organisms like bacteria. Yet if I was talking to someone on the topic of abortion and human rights, my answer would be very different indeed. It would be a clear and resounding no. Now why is this the case? Well, because human life, what can be referred to as personhood, is not the same as cellular life. Something that's very important to be upfront about since such a distinction impacts more than the field of ethics when it comes to pregnancy. It also impacts the field of ethics when it comes to treating cancer patients. Why? Well, because what is a zygote? The technical term for the fertilized egg cell that will go on to become a fetus. Ultimately, it's a living human cell that's genetically distinct to who it draws its nutrients from. By the way, put a pin in the phrase genetically distinct for later. Now, do you know what else counts as a living human cell that's genetically distinct to its host from who it draws nutrients from? A cancer cell. So unless you're about to argue that cancer treatments such as surgery, hormone therapy, and chemo destroy the sanctity of human life, you have to acknowledge that the definition of life used in cellular biology is not valid in this discussion, that our notion of human life must come from elsewhere. Now we'll come back to a valid definition of personhood later on, but for now, let's see what else they have to say.
But we know human life begins at some point. Here are a few things to remember while you think about when that is. First, life doesn't begin at birth. It isn't logical to say life begins at birth because that would suggest that the baby inside the womb one day prior to birth wasn't alive. It's not reasonable to say an individual who is alive at birth is not alive one day prior to birth. The only difference is where they are. So we know life does not begin at birth.
Except any difference we zero down on will be the only difference involved. Though not all differences are distinct enough to fall to your point about one day it's life, the other day it's not life. One difference that does fall to that point, however, is the difference of conception. According to your logic, it's not reasonable to say that an individual who is alive at conception is not alive one day prior to conception. After all, the only difference is where the genetic material is. So well done in refuting your own position with your very first argument. However, there's more to the matter than that. Namely, who actually argues life begins at birth? Well, that would be biblical literalists, at least those honest enough to acknowledge what it says. Genesis chapter 2 verse 7 is very clear that Adam came to life with his first breath, gaining his human soul in the process. Now, maybe you think that Adam is the rare exception, being the first man and all. However, further biblical reading reveals the idea that the fetus counts as human life to be entirely baseless from a biblical perspective. Perhaps the clearest example of this comes in Exodus chapter 21, verses 22 through 25, which readers quote, "If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise." End quote. Just to be clear about the text, biblical scholars agree that by gives birth prematurely, the passage is inclusive of miscarriage, instances in which the fetus does not survive. The serious injury is reference to the woman, which when we consider the punishment forwarded by this passage, tells us a lot. It tells us that if the Bible considered the fetus to be a human life, then the punishment for murdering said person would be death. However, if the fetus is only property, the punishment for destroying the husband's property would be a fine. So which of these is demanded for causing a miscarriage? Well, it's the latter. A fine. Property. So the Bible and its authors, divine or mundane be they in origin, did not view the fetus to be a human being. And this is why Numbers 5 describes in detail how if a husband believes his wife to have committed adultery, she is to be fed a drug that will cause her to have a miscarriage, supposedly if she has been unfaithful. That's right, the Bible prescribes abortion as a test for adultery. Why? Well, because the Bible views life to begin as the soul enters the body at the time of first breath. That is the biblical standard on not one, not two, but 3 separate accounts.
Second, life doesn't begin at viability. Many argue that human life begins once a baby can survive on her own outside the womb. But there are problems with this argument too. After all, viability changes based on technology. Today, babies can be born at 24 weeks and survive. But 200 years ago, that wasn't possible. Viability is also determined based on where you are born. Wealthy nations make things possible for babies that wouldn't be possible in a poorer country. Does that mean a 24-week baby in the United States is more alive than a 24-week baby in the jungles of the Congo? Of course not. So life must be determined by something other than viability.
Now, this is one of the main points I wanted to address with this video. The way in which Stephanie Gray very dishonestly forwards the claim that many people argue life begins when the fetus is viable. This simply isn't true. The reality is that once the fetus is viable, an abortion is just induced labour or a C-section. Yet that's something practically unheard of. Nobody sits around for 24 weeks, that's 5.5 months, before deciding they no longer want a child. A demonstrable fact. In 2019, the Centre for Disease Control released their 2016 statistics on abortion, and the results are telling. The vast majority, 65.5% of abortions, take place within the first 8 weeks of gestation. Almost all, 91%, take place within the first trimester, so within the first 12 weeks. Then a further 7.75% of abortions take place between the 13th and 21st week, leaving only 1.2% of abortions which take place after the 21st week, the main reason for which is very important. Pregnancy carries with it many complications, and sadly a fetus just isn't viable sometimes and is a threat to the very life of the host person, something that only becomes more prevalent in countries with poorer medical infrastructure. Sometimes an expecting parent has to make the tough call to terminate a pregnancy to save their life. And that is heartbreaking. That is why the right to life is one of the rights violated by abortion bans. Because whilst it may sound easy to make provisions for when the host person's life is in danger, history has shown us time and time again that that's just not the case. It's shown us that anti-abortion bills supported by groups such as What Would You Say force people into a position where they're unable to get safe abortions, so have to seek back alley alternatives, putting them not only at risk of imprisonment, but great medical risk, just to save their life. Fact is, they're not the only ones forced into similar situations. There is no way to outlaw abortion. It is a necessity that women, trans men, MB folk and intersex people will continue to seek out for a variety of reasons, even in places where it is banned, no matter the personal risk. It is a historical fact that abortion bans do not lower the rates of abortion. All they in fact do is increase the rates of unsafe abortions and abortion-related mortality. The real way to reduce abortion is to increase both access to and the quality of comprehensive sex and relationship education that teaches people how to use contraceptives. A fact we have known as far back as 1994, the year I was born. And yet, rather than using that information and supporting contraception, all you do is continue to fight abortion access, violating numerous human rights in the process, including the right to life. All whilst you have the gall to label yourself pro-life, an incredibly twisted joke on your behalf.
Third, life does not begin with the heartbeat. We know that living things only come from other living things. It wouldn't be possible then for the embryo to be non-living for the first few weeks and suddenly spring into life. So the embryo has to be alive prior to the heartbeat. Does this mean that we can be alive without a heartbeat? Yes. That's actually what makes the newly conceived embryo more functionally impressive than a born person. The embryo has an ability to live, grow, and move through the stages of human development without the feature you and I need to continue our growth and development.
You do realize that your bastardization of biogenesis would mean gametes, the scientific term for both sperm and the egg cells, would also have to be living prior to fertilization. This is even though they are not living by any recognizable definition, whether it be cellular biology or the philosophy of ethics and personhood. In reality, biogenesis posits that complex life does not merely spontaneously generate or magically appear as once believed. people did not understand that maggots came from tiny eggs laid by flies. Therefore, they used to believe maggots just appeared on rotting food. Then when bacteria were discovered, the same principle was applied to them, only for said concept to be disproven by Louis Pasteur. Pasteur showed us that if you boiled water and kept it in a sealed container, bacteria would fail to propagate and the water would remain safe to drink. He then used this technique and the underlying principle to go on to develop methods of making both milk and wine safer to drink. Methods that given time would go on to be called pasteurization after the man that led the way. That is biogenesis. Complex organisms as a whole are formed by other complex organisms. It does not mean that every step of the way must be living. Taking things even further back from the gametes, every sperm and egg cell is formed primarily of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Biogenesis does not mean said elements must also be living. However, on the heartbeat in particular, virtually nobody, perhaps nobody at all on the pro-choice side, forwards this as a qualifier for life. Why? Because the heart isn't that special. It's just a muscle that contracts rhythmically. The only reason we hold the heart in high esteem is because people used to believe it was responsible for both thought and emotion, something that has survived to this day through many common expressions. Hell, even the Bible does this in Exodus with the way in which it claims God hardened the Pharaoh's heart. Truth is, it's anti-abortion zealots who rely on that irrational connection to create horrific bills that force people seeking abortion to listen to a fetus's heart before receiving an abortion, adding to the stress of what can already be a pretty difficult time, whilst allowing medically illiterate Bible thumpers to proselytize at people seeking their basic human rights. As for the fetus being functionally impressive because it's not reliant on its own heart, the only reason the fetus can survive that way is because it's reliant on its host. Meanwhile, we can do the same with a machine. And what's more is we don't need to strip another human being of their bodily autonomy to achieve that. Because let's not lose sight of what you're trying to tiptoe around. What you forward as this wondrous and amazing thing in the context of this video is actually treating a human being as an object, specifically an incubator, as a birthing vat, that they're something that can have their bodily autonomy violated on a legal level for no just reason, to force them to provide labour against their will, something that carries with it high risk of medical complications and can even result in death. One meta-analysis, an analysis of multiple studies, found the percentage of long-term complications caused by pregnancy to be as high as 31%. A fact that needs to be taken into consideration.
If life doesn't begin at birth, viability, or heartbeat, when does it begin? Life begins at conception, fertilization. At fertilization, a living mother and father give life to a whole living organism, genetically distinct from his or her mother and father. No, the embryo doesn't look like everyone else, but aren't we past the idea that someone has to look a certain way before they are considered human?
Wow, really? You're going to compare a zygote or a fetus to people of colour? Also, you completely ignored the number one qualifier most people use for human life, for personhood, and that's sentience, the capacity to feel, perceive, or experience subjectively. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This is what distinguishes a human being from a tumour. Reminder that said tumours fit the genetically distinct qualifier you mention in your video. Now, when discussing fetal growth, there are two main periods to look into. Periods that relate to neuromaturation, literally brain maturation. The first is the development of the central nervous system that allows us to experience and process our surroundings via our senses. The fetus only starts to develop thalamocortical fibers, strands of nerves necessary for perception of such things as pain, at around 23 weeks of gestation. However, it takes an additional 6 or 7 weeks for the nerves to reach a state capable of processing said sensations. Likewise, the cerebral cortex, the part of the brain responsible for personality, intelligence, motor function, planning, and processing sensory information, everything that makes a human being human, said part of the brain develops around the same time as those fibers, well beyond the 24th week of gestation, the period of viability and the cutoff point for abortion in the UK. Now, it's important to talk about the way they measured this, and that is they looked for EEG waves in fetuses, electrical impulses in the cerebral cortex mentioned before, the absence of which, by the way, are used to declare brain death in hospitals. The idea here being that if a loss of such brain signals can legally classify someone as dead, then the gaining of such signals could be used to classify someone as alive. And this is not some new and radical position on personhood. 2 of the articles I linked, which showed when the cerebral cortex starts to function, allowing for the possibility of sentience in discussion of personhood relating to abortion, were published in the 80s. So to throw out heartbeat and ignore neuromaturation is actively dishonest and doesn't offer your viewers the knowledge they should have if they want to talk on the topic. It really does them a disservice that will only result in greater frustration and anger when people who hold the pro-choice position fail to align with the script you're handing them. Another problem with the whole life begins at conception is the fact that half of all fertilized eggs fail to implant. Yet Christian parents aren't walking around holding a funeral for every child they've had. It's only a human life when you can use it to control the lives of other people and strip them of their human rights, but never when it's an inconvenience to you. Also, let's be consistent here. If life does begin at conception, that means your God chooses to kill one baby for every person on this planet. After all, the Bible makes very plain that he has control over people's reproductive systems. Also, those rates of failed implantation are from today. With modern medicine and dietary access, they would have been much higher before. So again, pretending abortion goes against the Christian God or what's written in the Bible just doesn't fly. You are the source of these beliefs, not some mythical entity.
Think of it like a Polaroid picture. Initially, all you will see are black smudge marks. The moment the photo is taken, however, the image is captured. It just needs time to develop. The same is true for you and me. The moment of sperm-egg fusion, we, in our uniqueness from our parents, began to exist. We just needed time to develop. Let's review. Life doesn't begin at birth, because that suggests you aren't alive the day before birth. Life doesn't begin at viability because viability depends on where you were born and when. Life doesn't begin at the heartbeat either because that requires you to believe the heartbeat emerged from someone that isn't alive. So we're left with one option. Life begins at conception, at fertilization. It's what science tells us and logic requires us to acknowledge.
Except nowhere in this video have you even attempted to use either science or logic. I thought maybe you linked some actual research on the matter in your video description, so went to check, only to discover that, no, you hadn't. All I found was this joke of a description that asserted that the video would be both fun and informative, when it was neither. It was in fact misinformation. It not only focused the issue of abortion on qualifying when human life began, but completely ignored the concept of personhood and sentience. Concepts used not only to discern when death takes place on a medical level, but also when life as we think of it on a human level begins. Now, if you appreciate what myself and Adita do here on the channel in fighting back against said misinformation, do know you can support us on Patreon. Your support gives us the funds to keep going and keep putting out videos involving this level of research. You can also check out our other videos to see more of what we have to offer. So with that said, we'd just like to thank our Patreon sponsors, giving a special thanks to the following people: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, Soraya and Katie, Garrett Van Voorst, Chelsea Williams, Justin Allen, Wellington Marcus, Atlas 5, and Sosh Daniels. And for myself and Adita, take care now.